What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and when it comes down to video games, I have, a fair amount of my favorite consoles. And considering that, I've done 3 entries where I talked about my favorite games from 3 specific consoles, all of which being Nintendo consoles, being the Switch, the GameCube, and the 3DS. So, surprisingly enough, this is my 4th one that I'm talking about, but it's one that I largely remember, that being the Game Boy Advance. And in fact, the Game Boy Advance has been a part of my life, especially considering around the time when the Game Boy Advance was around. I was going through a specifically tumultuous time in my life where I first learned that when I was first diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So, more often than not, it's the Game Boy Advance, GameCube, and the DS that mean a lot to me because of that moment. Or because of that time in my life. So it really says a lot when a lot of these are kind of some of my favorites. That being said, even with that, it kind of makes sense I'd make a list of the my top 10 favorite Game Boy Advance games. That being said, many of these are kind of my own, I guess I say, have to do with my own, dare I say, opinions of them and my own experiences with them, which says a lot because many of these are either played on hardware or through some form of emulation, which really does say a lot when you think about it. But that being said, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, starting off first at number 10, we have WarioWare Mega Micro Games. Yeah. Since we're starting this off with a more unlikely game that I have never played, in franchise I've never played, it really does say a lot once you realize I have had an exposure to the WarioWare franchise as a whole, because WarioWare Touched was my very first WarioWare game, ever since I had it for the Nintendo DS. So, even with that being said, so I had some experiences with the WarioWare franchise. That being said, I have never played any of the WarioWare franchises since then. So, I've had less of an exposure with the franchise as a whole, to the point where I seem to have fallen out of favor. That being said, I ended up getting back into the WarioWare franchise thanks to, not just Alpharad's, due to seeing like Let's Plays or such of Alpharad's own Mario style Pokemon ROM hack, Super Mario Mon, but also with when I ended up, which led me to essentially play through WarioWare Mega Micro Games on my Nintendo Switch's Game Boy Advance emulator for the Switch Online service. And honestly, for what I know, this game is actually pretty solid. Granted, it's basically an entry that granted, I've never played the WarioWare franchise for the longest time, so I was a little rusty with all of that. But I really found myself enjoying the first entry as a whole. And even with that, it makes me want to find a way to find access to any of the other WarioWare titles and play through them. Maybe WarioWare Twisted or WarioWare Smooth Moves. It's only a matter of time before it happens. I'll be glad when it does. Moving on next at number 9, we have Golden Sun. Alright. As much as you guys know, I love role-playing games. Specifically, Japanese role-playing games, or JRPGs. So, honestly, when it comes down to it, I'm willing to essentially enjoy it. That being said, the most I've played in terms of the JRPG landscape were largely Pokemon and Fire Emblem. So it took me a while to branch out to other JRPG entries. As we've definitely seen with as I've definitely seen with Final Fantasy. However, that being said, considering I learned that Golden Sun was actually a part of the was essentially one of the most notable JRPGs, especially being one of the few JRPGs that was on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance console, I've actually wanted to find a way to try it out. And however, I had no way of playing this on any original hardware. And in fact, it wasn't until I learned how to emulate on my phone that I eventually got into playing through the original Golden Sun, which eventually transferred to when I got the Nintendo Switch Online service on my Switch, and I played through a little bit of Golden Sun. That being said, I ended up falling in love with it to the point that, honestly, I am surprised that but I am surprised that we have never had a Golden Sun entry since the version on the DS. And honestly, I think Nintendo's leaving a lot of money on the table by just basically not releasing a Golden Sun game or remake on the Switch. I mean, I would pay a lot of money for that. Also, the synergy gimmick, where basically, with many characters being espers and having access to elemental gimmicks like Venus adepts having access to earth and plant magic, Mars adepts having fire magic, Mercury adepts having healing or water or ice magic, and Jupiter adepts having wind or, oddly enough, lightning magic. It really does have its own fair amount of... I really enjoy it. Granted, it's at this much because I haven't played past a certain part of Golden Sun, the first Golden Sun, and even with that, I have yet to play the second and third games in the series, so yeah, this really does say a lot. I guess that's what I get for playing nothing but Pokemon and Fire Emblem for a good amount of my life. Moving on next, at number 8, we have Final Fantasy VI Advance. Speaking of the fact that I haven't I haven't played Final Fantasy till recently. Yeah. It really said, yeah. I hadn't played Final Fantasy until recent years. Like, it wasn't until I didn't start playing Final Fantasy until like around 2019, 2020, when I first borrowed Final Fantasy, the Switch port of Final Fantasy X and X-2 from a library. And I ended up playing it on my Switch to the point where I was like, wow, this is actually an amazing game. And while I did have some hard, which led me to essentially want to play through more Final Fantasy titles. Unfortunately, it led me to play through Final Fantasy XII, which is one of my least favorite entries in the franchise. Namely because of the job system, which is just way too difficult for me to comprehend. However, it wasn't until like around 2022, 2023, 2024, like around one of those 3 years, that I decided to give the more classic titles in the franchise a whirl. And this led me to play through 3 of those. Those being the original Final Fantasy VII on the Switch, the iOS/Android version of Final Fantasy IV, and of course, on the Game Boy Advance emulator on my phone, I ended up playing through Final Fantasy VI Advance. Now, while I didn't get too far into Final Fantasy VI Advance than I did Final Fantasy IV, literally, I am at the part where you get to each story, like Locke's story where you can recruit Celis, the Sabin's part of the story where you can eventually recruit the likes of Shadow and Cyan, and Terra's part of the story which involves going back to Narsh. Either way, Final Fantasy VI is ironically a solid game. And granted, I am currently watching a Let's Play of a modded version of Final Fantasy VI, and it got me even more excited to try and play through the entire thing. And the fact that Final Fantasy VI has been a big influence in the Countdown community, where a good amount of Countdown makers have at least had Final Fantasy VI or Kefka as either their favorite game or favorite Final Fantasy game or favorite villain in the video game villain. Many of them have it's influenced me to make my own channel and even further try out Final Fantasy VI. Granted, maybe in the granted, like the other two, I haven't fully played through it, but considering how this year I am trying my best to clear the original Final Fantasy VII from my backlog, yeah, there's a good chance in the near future I'm gonna end up doing the same thing with both Final Fantasy VI Advance and Final Fantasy IV. So I'll get back to you on that once I do so. So yeah. Moving on next at number 7, we have The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. Alright. When it comes down to it, the Game Boy Advance has had a fair amount of... When I had my Game Boy Advance, I played a fair amount of franchises as growing up. However, specifically in terms of my efforts with the Game Boy Advance, those games were mostly like either Pokemon or Mario, which really does say a lot. However, that being said, I've been interested in wanting to play through other games for the Game Boy Advance. And bringing up efforts of me going to Target or Walmart when I was younger and spending time in the video game area just playing the Game Boy Advance or GameCube demo displays and playing through specific games on those, that's mostly how I've been introduced to specific franchises or specific entries. One of which being Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. And honestly, the fact that I was able to... And honestly, it's surprisingly one of the few Zelda games I really enjoy. And this is and in all fairness, the very first Zelda game I ever played was Ocarina of Time. So it was a very big shift from going through Ocarina of Time and its style to the more cartoony style of Minish Cap. And even since then, that it stuck with me. Even as I experience other titles in the franchise, like Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, Link Between Worlds, Breath of the Wild, it was Minish Cap that allowed me to experience the other Zelda titles as a whole. And while I did play through Minish Cap for a while on my phone, I was extremely excited when it was announced to be on the Nintendo Switch Online service for the GBA. And that's when I ended up playing, and that's where I played the most of it. And I got further in that title than I did, and I got further in that version for the Switch GBA emulator for the Switch Online service than I did on my phone. Which makes me want to find a way to go back to playing through the game. Just really does say a lot. Also, the fact that we have had a whole effort where Link was able to shrink down and enter into the world of the Minish, it kind of makes me wish we've had that in the... It kind of makes me wish we had that in some of the more recent games. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Skyward Sword's whole Sky World to Surface World aspect and the whole wall merging gimmick of Link Between Worlds. But honestly, if we did bring back the Minish or the Picori in a later game, I would be ecstatic if that was the case. Just, yeah. Moving on, next at number 6, we have Mother 3. Yup. Honestly, in all fairness, I think we all know the story of this one. But when it comes down to it, Mother 3 is one of the games that while I haven't played through it, it's it's one of those games that honestly has really had a big effect on me, especially considering everything. Granted, I didn't get like most of these most franchises is in the first half of this list. I didn't get into the Mother franchise until like late. And I mean like when the 3DS eShop was up late. And even with that, the first time I was introduced to the Mother franchise was through Chugga Conroy's Let's Plays of Earthbound and Mother 3. And it was thanks to him that I decided to try both games for myself, since I started by downloading Earthbound on my Nintendo 3DS, on one of my Nintendo 3DSs, when the 3DS eShop was still up, and honestly, I really enjoyed it. And in fact, I wanted to do the same thing with Mother 3. However, considering certain things, I had no way to download that game onto my DS, onto any of my DS systems. And even with that, the only way to download it was to emulate it on my phone. Basically using specific means. Namely, well, unpromoted berserkers. And, if you catch my drift. And honestly, the fact that the only way to play Mother 3 is through this sort of emulation, is kind of unfortunate, because it is an amazing game. I mean, the battle style is a little hard, since you gotta you gotta attack to the rhythm of the music. But the story, oh my god, from watching Chugga Conroy's Let's Play of Mother 3 and experiencing the first chapter as a whole in playing through the game, oh my lord, it makes me so excited. And it's such a beautiful and poignant story that the fact that Nintendo has not released this at all in the United States is just a crying shame. Nintendo, there is a whole market of fans that want to enjoy this game and many other Japanese only games that you released. Please just at least give us a way to legitimately play these games. We are begging you. I am begging you. Please. Moving on, next at number 5, we have Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. Alright. Going from the more serious side to the more interesting side, if you already hadn't guessed, the most I've played growing up with a Game Boy Advance were Pokemon and Mario games. Which is saying a lot because, granted, Pokemon is one of my favorites. And it was during around this time that I was basically told to stop liking Pokemon because to stop liking Pokemon in order to make friends. And keep in mind, this was when I discovered, when I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So, it was a really tumultuous time for me. So, for the most aspect, I had to hide the fact that I played Pokemon from other people in order to make friends. And so most of what I played was Mario. But even with that, it was when I discovered a lot of great games in terms of the Mario franchise. One of which was the Mario and Luigi franchise. Because the first of those games I played through was Partners in Time, which eventually led me to playing through Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, the prequel to Partners in Time. And honestly, I have to say, I enjoyed Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga wholeheartedly. Because this was... And keep in mind, I had not played through the Paper Mario franchise outside Thousand Year Door. So, I know when Mario can be a little, funny. I know how humorous Mario can be. But the Mario and Luigi franchise not only revels on its on the humor the Mario franchise brings, but has some amazing stories that, honestly, you wouldn't expect from any aspect. And honestly, from the whole Peach's voice getting stolen by Cackletta and Fawful in order to and replaced with explosive speech to many other aspects involving the Bean Kingdom, to the introduction of the Bean Kingdom, to... Honestly, it was basically one of the most riveting games I ever played. And yeah, I had a actual physical copy growing up. I mean, I ended up selling that copy as well as my copy of Partners in Time. But eventually, I did end up getting back into the Mario and Luigi franchise. And eventually with Bowser's Inside Story and Dream Team. And I got back into playing Superstar Saga as a whole on the Game Boy Advance emulator on the Switch Online service. Yeah, most of these I ended up getting back into thanks to the Switch Online service. And honestly, I haven't looked back. Granted, I also haven't gotten back into the game because it was a long time since I first played it, so most of my knowledge of it was a little fuzzy. But honestly, when I did get a chance to play it, I realized that it was as good as I remembered it. It was as good as I remembered it. It allowed me to remember that it was good as I remembered it from when I was a kid. Maybe even more. And even with that, the fact that it also introduced us to Fawful, who is one of the funniest characters in the game, really does say a lot. especially when you consider that his minion has basically decided to follow in his footsteps by giving us a nice bit of chaos in terms of his channel, which really does say a lot. Which again really says a lot when you think about it. So yeah. Also, hey Logan. Moving on next at number 4, we have Pokemon Emerald. Oh boy. Yeah. Honestly, you kind of knew this was coming. And of course, if there's ever a game that honestly I really like, that I enjoyed from the Game Boy Advance era of Nintendo, it's Pokemon. And especially Pokemon Generation 3. I mean, in fact, Pokemon Generation 3 was a big part of that time where I discovered I was on the when I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. As basically, it was one of my favorite games. And one of those few games that I never stopped playing or talking about as a kid. In fact, I still have my own physical copy of Pokemon Ruby that I had from when I was a kid growing up. So basically, Hoenn, as much as Unova is one of my favorite regions, Hoenn holds a very special place in my heart. And even with that, I spent so much time playing through Pokemon on Ruby. That being said, when it came to Pokemon Emerald, I actually wanted to play it, but I wasn't able to get a physical copy until like around the time of Gen 4. Namely because it was a time when I basically was told to stop liking Pokemon in order to make friends. And so I didn't get a chance to do so. And even with that, I did make some friends, and many of which who like Pokemon. I didn't have Emerald at that point. But I mostly was trying to hide my love of Pokemon around this time. But that being said, even with that, when I did get Pokemon Emerald, I ended up I played through it. It was basically fairly nice to go through Hoenn as a whole in its entirety. And surprisingly enough, the fact that this is a reason why I really love the third versions of each of the games from the first 4 generations. To the point that I put in a lot of hours in the third versions, from Yellow to Crystal, Platinum, and definitely Emerald, well, as a whole. That being said, oh man, Emerald is one of the few games I enjoyed so much. And the fact that one of my friends in high school, I bonded with one of my friends in high school due to our shared love of Pokemon, since he had Sapphire and I more or less had Emerald. Well, I had Ruby actually. I didn't have Emerald at the time. But eventually, when I got Emerald, I played through it. And more often than not, when it comes down to it, it's proven how I still have a love of Emerald even now. Especially since one of the randomized Nuzlockes I'm still doing is an randomized Nuzlocke in Pokemon Emerald. And even Pokemon Emerald Imperium in terms of difficulty hacks. In fact, many of the reasons why I still like Pokemon to this day, even with the more recent entries, were due to Emerald and even Hoenn as a whole, and due to that time when I had to hide my Pokemon love. So I thank Emerald for basically keeping that spark alive. It really says a lot. Moving on, next at number 3, we have Advance Wars. Yep, another franchise that I basically did not experience until recently. And honestly, this one's gonna be one of my more interesting ones since I didn't have Advance Wars on my radar. Again, that was because of another game that basically had the same sort of feel as Advance Wars that more or less took over my mind, which we'll get to soon enough. But even with that, Advance Wars was... But even with that, I actually wanted to play through specific games I never played through. And when I heard about Advance Wars, I was like, wait, what is Advance Wars? However, that being said, I, again, didn't recently get into the franchise until like around 2021, 2022, when I first downloaded it to be emulated onto the GBA emulator on my phone. That I realized, wow, this game is actually pretty solid. And keep in mind, considering how around that time it was thanks to Fire Emblem being on my brain, I was able to... The fact that I tried out Advance Wars being a more modern Fire Emblem entry, and a modern version of Fire Emblem, is something that really got me interested into it. Plus, it was also thanks to the, yeah, this is where the controversy comes in. Mangs. Yeah, I know a lot of people are gonna hate me for liking Mangs' content, but honestly, it was thanks to Mangs as a whole, considering what he did, but it was thanks to Mangs as a whole that I was introduced to Advance Wars. And honestly, if it wasn't for Mangs, I wouldn't have, well, I wouldn't have discovered how much I like the series. And yeah, while I do know that we do have there's an entire remake on the Switch, being Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp. Honestly, I have to say I like the original Advance Wars 1 due to the training segment, which is a nice little way to essentially which I feel is a nice little way to ease myself into the game as a whole. Man, honestly, I don't know much to say, but I really like Advance Wars. That's really much to say. Moving on next at number 2, we have Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3. Yeah. Speaking of which, the reason I didn't do my usual rules like one per franchise is naturally because, honestly, I knew I was going to have multiple Mario entries on my phone as I was going to have multiple Mario entries vying for this spot. I mean, heck, by the sheerest of margins, both Mario Party Advance and Mario Kart Super Circuit were close to getting on the list in the first. We're close to getting on the list. I mean, heck, even the Game Boy Video series was also close to getting on the list. That's how close this was. But considering how Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga were basically the pinnacle of Mario RPGs, courtesy of my younger self, it was young me who spent the most time playing Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3. And the fact that it's a Mario platformer really does say a lot, since my first ever Mario platformer I played was Super Mario Land for the Game Boy. And even though I did also play through both Super Mario 64 and Sunshine around this time, I spent a lot of time playing Super Mario Bros. 4, Super Mario Advance 3. To the point that was my first exposure to Super Mario Bros. 3 as a whole. And honestly, it really says a lot once you realize that I really appreciate how far the Mario platformers have gone since then. Granted, that being said, while I have played a lot of platformers, this was enough that it allowed me to remember my I still remember this because of how much I played it as a kid. This really does say a lot. But it's not number 1 because there's a specific game with a story attached to it that basically took the number 1 spot. That being said, number 1 is Fire Emblem. Yeah. Specifically for me, when it comes down to it, like I said, like many other people, I was introduced to Fire Emblem through Super Smash Bros. Melee. In fact, I first saw Marth and Roy and was like, wait, where are they from? And eventually, as soon as I heard about Fire Emblem, I wanted to play it myself. And basically, this led into when I was around in the 8th or 9th grade, when one of my classmates when I was introduced to the Fire Emblem franchise as a whole, with Fire Emblem 7, the first Fire Emblem game in the West, when by one of my classmates who had a copy of Fire Emblem 7 for the Game Boy Advance. And he let me play it, and honestly, I was hooked. The fact that I played through, since I didn't know what that game was all about, but I was willing to try, and I loved it. Granted, I didn't get past certain aspects, and certain parts of the game I didn't know about, but like how archers are super effective towards flyers. But even with that, this led me to want to try, it led me down a Fire Emblem rabbit hole that I enjoyed. And anyway, I found to play through Fire Emblem, I took it. In fact, the first time I learned how to jailbreak my iPod Touch, I ended up getting Game Boy Advance games on said iPod, and one of those was Fire Emblem, both Sacred Stones and Blazing Sword. And I really enjoyed Blazing Sword. And even with that, that led me to a whole new love of Fire Emblem that continued with the likes of Awakening, Fates, Echoes, and Three Houses. And even with that, it wasn't until like 2020, 2021 that I discovered how to emulate videos on my phone, and emulate video games on my phone. And again, one of the few games I ended up playing through were the games of the Fire Emblem franchise, with Blazing Sword leading the charge. And even with that, as much as I've played through games like Awakening, or games I've played through the most, like Fates and Three Houses, I would say that Blazing Sword is up there with one of my most played games. Even when it was revealed to be on the Switch Online service for the Game Boy Advance, I was excited because this was a game that introduced me to the entire franchise I consider as one of my autistic special interests. And honestly, the fact that I was able to play through it as much as I have, I have to give some credit to the classmate that introduced me to that game on the bus when I was in middle school. Because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been the Fire Emblem fan that I am today. Really says a lot. And those are my top 10 favorite Game Boy Advance games. And I know that it's been I know it's in portrait mode, which is not ideal. In fact, I tried it with landscape mode, but it's hard to do so using only one hand. And, yeah. Honestly, I hope this doesn't penalize me, or my thoughts about my favorite Game Boy Advance game doesn't penalize me in anyone else's eyes. Because I really feel strongly about all of this, because this was a moment that was really one of the lighter points of my life during a somewhat tumultuous time that I was going through. And honestly, if it wasn't for the Game Boy Advance and its game library, I wouldn't be where I am today. So, yeah. That being said, like, comment, subscribe, and join my Patreon if you want to at patreon.com/theautistic. Of course, don't feel pressured to pay for a tier. Just, if you want to join, and you can join with a free membership. Just don't feel pressure about paying in order to do that. I don't want anyone to basically ruin their financial standings with my Patreon. But either way, thanks everyone. And see you next time when I take on some more controversial. When I decide to get more controversial with a few of my hottest takes in gaming. See you then.